Rain still threatened, hadn't arrived. Stevic couldn't say why he was enthralled by the activities that had commenced with the truck's arrival. Some intimation, he supposed in retrospect, though it wasn't uncommon for him to buzz the cafe 2 or 3 times in a procrastinating morning. The hole was steep and accurate, hewing to the spray-painted plan still visible in 2 corners where the lines of paint meeting had pooled and blurred, an inverted foam booth of empty dirt and rubble. 3 fat fitted planks lay stacked beside the hole, sized to make a rough cover, Stevic guessed. The hole's former contents had been heaped precariously at the curb. The hydrant wasn't likely to be back in commission too soon at this rate. The orange cone remained like an ill-fitted condom stuck on its head. The truck, however, was gone. And then it was back, jerking to a halt at the curb before him, as if responsive to Stevic's own presence, to his attentions. However absurd this notion might be, Stevic had conceived it. With an unhurried persistence, the jumpsuited men emerged again and opened the van's rear, then stepped inside to wrangle out what at first might have seemed another object, but then revealed itself to be a man, a human captive. The man was dressed in the same uniform as though recently demoted from their company. But his skin, Stevic noted wearily, as if this fact beckoned to outrage he ought to feel rising within him, but didn't, was darker than theirs. His head shaved, where their hair was intact, his 2 or 3 day beard rough, where theirs were, in one case, trimmed into a goatee, and in the other shaved clean. So the jumpsuits, rather than suggesting equivalence between the 3, framed difference. A cruddy cloth gagged the captive's mouth. Another bound his wrists in front of him. His eyes didn't trouble to plead as his captors led him to the fresh hole and lowered him within, taking care not to scuff his elbows on the crumbled lip. They'd measured well. The captive nestled just under the 3 fat boards when these were fitted over his head. One of the jumpsuited operatives stood atop the boards, testing their firmness with apparent satisfaction, while the other quickly loaded the cones into the back of the truck. Now, at last, the rain began to fall. "How," Stevic began, then faltered, unsure of his question. "How long are you going to leave him in there?" The 2 could barely be bothered to hesitate in their hurry for the shelter of the truck's cab. "We're on installation and delivery," the clean-shaven one said as he assumed the driver's seat. "Pick up another department." "Are we talking hours or days or weeks?" Stevic said, locating perhaps belatedly some faint civic courage, a notion that he'd absorbed certain duties as a local witness to the open-air procedure. Perhaps by default, but no less legitimately for that. Besides, others inside the cafe might be watching through the window. His question was perhaps a feeble one, but for anyone observing, the fact that he'd stood up from his bench and begun some sort of stalling interrogation could be seen as crucial, either in a deeper intervention to be conducted by more effective or informed members of the community, or in some later accounting of Stevic's own comportment and behavior. "I really didn't look at the schedule in this case," the driver said, "but they're rarely installed for more than 3 or 4 days in a single location." Anything longer wouldn't be seen as humane, I suppose? "More like these measures simply aren't effective beyond a certain point. Listen, we gotta go." "Those boards are in no way tight enough to keep the rain from falling on him," Stevic pointed out. By placing their hole so near the hydrant, they'd prevented a parked car from giving shelter to the hole. On the other hand, perhaps they'd spared the hole's inhabitant something terrifying in being doubly pinned by the low ceiling of a vehicle's undercarriage. Probably Stevic was guilty of overthinking. It was impossible to find a parking space in this neighborhood, so they'd settled on the obvious solution. "That's generous of you to notice, citizen," the driver said. He gestured to the occupant of the passenger seat, the goateed man, who'd been sitting with his arms crossed and rolling his eyes, miming impatience. Now, this silent partner produced something from the floor of the truck's cab. A compact black umbrella, the inexpensive double-hinge kind you might purchase at a shoe repair shop, having ducked in during a gale. He handed it to the driver, who passed it through the open window to Stevik. "This is why we're grateful you came along when you did," the driver said, nodding to indicate the hole. "Don't be afraid to stand on top. It'll easily support your weight." With that, they were gone, and for the last time. Stevik never saw them again. The driver hadn't been misleading him when he alluded to the narrow specialization of their tasks. Now there was only the hole, its occupant, and Stevik with his own duties. For when freed by the truck's departure, he turned to face the cafe. No one, in fact, was regarding him from the window, now streaked with rain and curtained by a dripping overhang. Stevik opened the umbrella. The hole was silent. Stevik could easily have gone home, but instead he stepped over, tested the soundness of the footing on top. There was little doubt he watched them work, and sheltered both himself and the sturdy boards from the rain as well as he could beneath the feeble rigging of black cloth and wire. In a lull, the aproned counterman stepped outside the cafe door for a cigarette break. He nodded curtly at Stevik, exhaled smoke rising into the rain. "So you're in charge now, huh?" he said. I didn't want to leave him completely alone. There had been no sound, barely a detectable motion from the hole beneath his feet, where the captive now sat braced, knees wedged in dirt. "I wouldn't say I'm in charge in any wider sense," Stevik continued. "I'm something of a stopgap or placeholder, really." "I more than understand," the cafe employee said. "We're in a similar situation, just a gig between real jobs. That's what I keep telling myself." He tossed his fuming butt into the gutter, quite near. "There's a million stories like yours and mine." "That's not what I was getting at," Stevik began. But uninterested, the counterman had returned inside. The cafe's population had never completely recovered from the jackhammer exodus. That, combined with the rain, kept Stevik's vigil a lonely one. He preferred it, actually. The usual early afternoon dog walkers passed by, hunched in tented plastic ponchos, their smaller dogs, the terriers and dachshunds, sheathed in sleeveless plaid coats. But Stevik had always regarded the walkers as ships on a distant sea, some passing flotilla. Even on days of bright sunshine, they were too occupied with canine herding and the management of plastic-bagged turds to engage in the human life of the street. Though few other humans acknowledged him, Stevik liked to believe that he was still a participant in the mainstream. Whether his relation to the man beneath the boards qualified as a human transaction was another question. Toward evening, the rain tailed, though not enough so that Stevik lowered the umbrella. The cafe's clientele turned over. The tables were set for dinner, decorated with lit candles, menus in place. The staff even switched off the Wi-Fi in order to chase out the most tenacious of the afternoon Googlers. Others of Stevik neighbors, the professionally dressed, beleaguered rush-hour subwayers, slaves in financial offices, trudged past the corner with their own umbrellas. Though Stevik always thought of them as upright sheep, some were surprisingly bold in their muttering. "What did you say?" Steve shouted back. "You heard me, friend. You're lowering property values for the rest of us." "Not in my backyard, eh?" Stevik said. "Boy, when something like this arrives in your midst, you learn pretty fast who's who in this neighborhood, you yuppie." Stevik spoiled for a fight, feeling now all the insurgent defiance that he ought to have summoned for the diggers of the hole. But what was done was done. Defense of what should never have been in the first place had become Stevik's province. You artists need to grow up and learn the difference between an installation piece and a hole in the ground, the man sneered. Surely Stevik's age or younger, yet dressed like Stevik's grandfather, he added. Slack ass. Stevik was incensed. There's a man in this hole. Don't bore me with your disgusting personal situation. It's not a personal situation, you fucker. Roll up and die, grubby. Ah! They charged with umbrellas outheld. Stevik feeling he'd abandoned his station but unable to stem the urge to gore the man on the sidewalk and see him plead for mercy in the rain. Yet the two men essentially missed, failed to engage, the broad, opened umbrellas merely grazing in a rubbery, wet shutter as they passed. The single thrust having apparently exhausted his neighbor as much as it did Stevik. The man regathered his briefcase tightly beneath his elbow. I need to go pay the nanny, he murmured as he slunk off. Stevik retreated to his task. So much for guys fighting in the city, huh? White guys. That was an aside from your narrator. It was night, and inside the cafe, the menus at several of the tables had been taken up, wine poured, little plates delivered, by the time another specialist made contact with Stevik. He wasn't, as Stevik might have hoped, a sentry arriving to relieve Stevik of a duty that, now that he contemplated it, he had to admit was self-assigned. Rather, the jumpsuited man, a sturdy, almost fat one this time, with heavy black-rimmed glasses and a Yankees cap shielding him from the rain, appeared to be some kind of inspector, charged with ensuring the rightness of the site and recording in cryptic shorthand with a ballpoint pen on a clipboarded sheet certain impressions. The man double-parked his car, the blinking hazard lights of which gave clear evidence of the passing nature of his visit, and suggested to Stevik a long itinerary of random checks still ahead of him. He then politely asked Stevik for assistance in drawing aside the cover of planks. Stevik, in turn, extended the umbrella to help protect the operative's clipboard while he wrote. The captive, Stevik noted with relief, didn't appear any more or less uncomfortable than when he'd first been lowered into his hole. He stood as if to acknowledge the inspector's attentions, but didn't glance upward, possibly not wishing to incur rebuke. Or perhaps he had merely grown incurious about what were, for him, routine operations. When the inspector went back to his car and returned bearing a wax paper cup with a straw and a pair of plastic-wrapped sandwiches, Stevik understood that he intended to feed the man in the hole, and saw also that the captive had at some point spat the dirty cloth from his mouth so that it now encircled his throat like a necklace. Probably it had never been secured to begin with, and the captive had not wished to embarrass the men who dug the hole by flaunting their ineffectual knotting skills. The inspector lowered the cup with a straw and a half a sandwich to within range of the captive's mouth, and the man in the hole quietly and efficiently fed and drank. Stevik considered the fact that the captive could have cried out at any point and had chosen not to. Perhaps he learned that it only led to more punishment, if punishment was the right word. Stevik had begun to realize that he ascribed a certain strength, a gravity and authenticity to the man in the hole, or perhaps to the hole itself, with which he wished to be associated, as in the sense of a shared undertaking. The passerby with whom he'd crossed umbrellas had been, in a manner, right. This was kind of a personal situation. Stevik helped the inspector replace the wooden planks over the hole, then gratefully accepted the gift of the second wrap sandwich, which turned out to be pleasantly peppery chicken salad, albeit on soggy white bread. Stevik had been hungrier than he realized. Before departing, the inspector went back to his car one last time, returning now with an olive green duffel, which he chucked gently to the edge of the hole just beside Stevik. What's that? Standard issue, the inspector explained obscurely. It'll be there when you need it. He offered Stevik a quick salute and was off. It was only after the cafe had closed for the night, the chairs overturned on the tables, that the rain had ceased completely, leaving Stevik with the question of whether his shift here ought to conclude. He shook out and shuddered at the umbrella and had just reached for the enigmatic duffel when he was greeted by the sound of his own name in the familiar voice of his ex, Charlotte. It was perhaps inevitable that she'd pass by if he camped out here all day. In another lifetime, which was what even yesterday seemed to be after this present occurrence, he might have been guilty of doing exactly that. As it happened, he'd overlooked completely the possibility of her wandering past. Charlotte was dressed and scented for a night on the town, clacking in her heels toward the subway entrance, most likely to undertake her usual carousel of Stevik's former favorite bars in the company of his lately out-of-touch friends. Well, now look at you, she joshed, keeping busy as usual. Stevik guiltily withdrew his hand from the duffel bag and stood alert to indicate his vigilance, though now, rain-cleared, umbrella-folded, it was hardly evident what his duties were. He'd always had to straighten his posture in Charlotte's presence, her height and perfect carriage a kind of warning or rebuke to him, and now he found himself wishing that she'd step off the curb down to his level. The 3 planks that covered the hole were too expertly flush to the asphalt to be of any help to him. There's a man in this hole, Charlotte. It was the second time he'd tried to even field by stating this absolute truth. To even the field by stating this absolute truth, almost as if he needed to hear it himself to believe it, though he'd been presiding there all day. He wanted acknowledgement of his effort, but first he had to establish the basic situation. Sure, Charlotte said. I've heard of this sort of thing. I guess I'd heard of it too, though it's different to have it right in front of you. Still, I guess it has to be somewhere. True enough, said Charlotte. I just hadn't pictured you getting involved. But by your logic, I suppose someone had to step forward. Stevik couldn't really improve on this sentiment, so he let it stand. So, what's in the bag? Nothing was lost on Charlotte. He had to give her that. More sandwiches, I suspect, Stevik said, surprising himself with the guess. Should they be called rations or provisions? It depended on who was eating them, he supposed. They're not bad if you like chicken salad. Take one if you're hungry. Charlotte had by this time poked inside the bag, assuming her usual privileges in regard to Stevik's boundaries, and pulled out a plastic wrap jumpsuit, identical except for its virgin state to those worn by the operatives and by the captive below. There appeared to be 4 or 5 of these stacked within the small duffel. You're hired, Charlotte exclaimed. You've been promoted from temp position to staff. Stevik found himself pleasingly able to ignore her goading. In many ways, Charlotte, like much else, was receding from view. The new conditions made irony a luxury. Was he meant to hoard the jumpsuits for his own use, or to recruit other operatives from the neighborhood? Or for that matter, were they intended for future incarcerees? Stevik considered the possibility that he'd eventually be fitted for a hole himself. The beauty of the uniform was that it settled nothing. Do you want to see him? He asked Charlotte, and immediately regretted a question that seemed inappropriate, even somewhat craven on his part. He knew only after he'd said it that he would never again let himself use the man in the hole as a token or bargaining chip. He was a person. Charlotte's cavalier reply felt predestined. No, thank you, she said. I should go. I'm running late. But it's really good to see you doing so well, Stevik. Her voice was like a pat on a baby's downy skull. The hint of tenderness Cloaking Charlotte's dismissal disgusted Stevik. Talk about your passing connections. Stevik felt closer after a single day to the man in the hole, though they've exchanged not a word. As he watched Charlotte make her way up the street, Stevik experienced only relief that she'd refused his suggestion. To pry up the planks when he had nothing to offer was a small indignity he had spared the captive below. The last thing Stevik wished to do, after all, was annoy him with inessentials. Success in an endeavor like this one lay in the details. Stevik was certain he was going to do a good job.